The camera was watching a patch of sand. Pay attention to the deep trenches at the edge of the frame and how every tide they crept 50 yards further down the beach. The card held 85 days. Marcus Thorne pulls it from the housing strapped to a rusted channel marker above the nesting grounds on the barrier island off the Carolina coast on a Tuesday in August. The camera was not watching for boats, and it was not watching a trail. It was watching the shore, a flat, protected expanse of dunes where one of the last stable populations of loggerhead sea turtles in the region came to lay their eggs. There were not many of those beaches left anymore. There were once, before the developers built the coast into a concrete wall and the artificial lights drove the hatchlings back into the dunes instead of the sea. The island had been a sanctuary for decades, until the black market poaching got so aggressive that the Federal Wildlife Service did the only thing left to do, which was to shut down the beach entirely and put a camera on what remained. Guarding a turtle nesting ground with a camera is a desperate measure, but that is what it had come to. A single clutch of loggerhead eggs is worth thousands on the illicit exotic animal and aphrodisiac market. The turtles take 30 years to reach reproductive age, and the females who lay on this island were hatching before Thorne was even born. The biologists who monitored the beach had cataloged the nests, carefully burying passive RFID chips in the sand directly beneath the egg chambers. That way, a clutch pulled from the barrier island could be proven later, if found in a trafficker's warehouse, to have come from exactly there. They had tagged the nests and pointed the camera at them. And twice a season, someone took a skiff out to change the card and count what was left. The camera was watching the dunes the way you watch an inheritance slipping through your fingers. Thorne knew the barrier island the way every warden in the sector knew it now, not as a thriving ecosystem, but as a casualty report that had been worsening for 20 years. It had fallen so far that the decline became a quarantine, and the quarantine became a camera. He had been there when the biologists buried the last of the RFID chips, kneeling in the coarse sand, tagging nests that represented the entire future of the regional population. It had felt, he said later, less like conservation than standing guard at a hospice. The camera was part of that vigil. It was there to record the survival of the beach, or whatever shape its end took. 2,400 images. Thorne begins to scroll. For the first stretch, it is the quietest card on the coast. The dunes in pale moonlight. A ghost crab skittering past. A pelican. The monitoring biologist on her June visit kneeling in the frame with a clipboard. High tide washing the lower frame. A nesting camera is mostly uneventful because turtle eggs do not move and the mothers only visit in the dark. And the whole point of the camera is to record a stretch of sand where ideally nothing ever happens until the hatchlings erupt. Then, in the fourth week of the card, there is a shadow. It is low, geometric, the shape of a fiberglass skiff pulled high onto the sand at the very top edge of the frame where the dunes meet the salt marsh. As far from the main nesting cluster as a thing can be and still be in the picture. There is no person near it. There is no person in any of the frames that night. Just the dark hull of the skiff at the edge of the sanctuary, 400 yards from the marked nests, sitting in the sea oats as if it belonged there. Thorne does not stop on it exactly, but he flags the timestamp. People break down. Boaters drift into closed waters. He keeps scrolling. 3 nights later, the skiff is back, but it is not where it was. It is closer, not by much, 50 yards maybe down the shoreline toward the nests, but unmistakably closer. The same hull, the same low profile pulled into a new spot 50 yards nearer the marked clutches than it had been before. And again, across the whole night of frames, there is no person. The boat moves, and the man who moves it does not show. Thorne stops scrolling. He goes back to the first frame of the skiff and starts again, slower, watching the boat instead of the sand. It comes down the beach like a creeping tide. Week 1, 400 yards out at the top edge. Week 2, 300. Week 3, 150. Each week, the skiff is pulled ashore roughly 50 yards closer to the marked nests. And each week, the man who pulls it stays entirely out of the frame. Coming and going, Thorne would realize, in the exact sliver of time between the camera's motion sensor cooldowns, or simply crawling low in the trench of the dunes where the lens could not quite reach. A man who had found the camera early and knew exactly where the blind spots were. Across 5 weeks, a boat with no person attached to it walked 350 yards down a shoreline toward the one thing the camera was there to protect, 50 yards at a time. And the only thing more unsettling than watching it happen was knowing that someone was doing it with absolute, chilling deliberation. There is a particular kind of dread in a machine that captures the result of an action, but never the actor. A poacher on a camera is terrifying, but he is at least a man. You can read his build, guess his tools, picture him digging. A skiff that is 50 yards closer every week and never once has a person beside it is something else. It turns the empty sand into a threat. Somewhere on that island, in the pitch black, a person Thorne could not see was killing the engine, dragging that heavy fiberglass hull onto the beach and leaving it closer. And the camera set to catch a criminal had caught instead the slow geometry of his patience, the arithmetic of a predator who had all the time in the world and intended to take every inch of it. And as the skiff came down the beach, the ground began to change. In the early frames, the dunes are whole, the smooth, wind-swept sand of the nests undisturbed. By the 3rd week of the skiff, there are depressions. By the 4th, there are deep, violent excavations in the sand where a clutch used to be. The chaotic craters a digger leaves when he rips out the eggs. The skiff was not just approaching the nesting grounds, it was consuming it from the perimeter inward, one marked nest at a time. And the man doing it was working the shoreline like a grim reaper, moving his extraction point down the beach after the digging. A biologist could read the holes like a crime scene photo. He was not blindly destroying the beach. He was meticulous. He used a thin metal probe to locate the soft sand of the egg chamber, dug straight down, extracted the clutch hole, and smoothed the sand back over to hide the theft from casual aerial patrols. The practiced motions of a man who by every sign in the sand believed he was a professional harvester, not a vandal. It was the cruelest part of the whole thing in a way, the sterile efficiency. A reckless amateur who tore up everything would have left a beach that screamed emergency. The poacher left a beach that looked almost peaceful, while systematically erasing an entire generation of an endangered species. The face came in the 6th week, and it came almost by accident. A frame at 3 a.m. The man for once standing upright, kneeling at a nest near the center of the cluster with a canvas sack in his hand, his head up and turned, startled by a rogue wave crashing louder than the rest. An older man, weathered in heavy maritime foul weather gear, with the unhurried economy of a person who had navigated these dark waters 1,000 times. He did not look like a cartel smuggler. He looked like a local commercial fisherman, which, in his own mind, was precisely what he was doing: fishing. The registration on the skiff parked deep in the marsh and the marked eggs in the coolers when they finally raided his property came back to a name the coastal wardens already knew: Silas Vance, 68, from a dying fishing village on the mainland across the Sound. And the Vances had been working the waters around the barrier island for as long as anyone had been running boats there. Silas had learned the shoals from his father, who had learned it from his, back into the century when the island was just a place you went to take what the ocean offered. The location of the best nests kept as local knowledge. Silas Vance had taken eggs from that beach decades ago when nobody cared and there were thousands of turtles to spare. And then the concrete poured, the lights went up, the turtles stopped coming, and the law stepped in. The population too far gone to allow any harvesting at all, and the thing his family had occasionally done on that island for generations had become a severe federal felony. It is hard to overstate what traditional access means to a family that has lost everything else to commercial overfishing and coastal development. It is not just stubbornness. It is closer to a warped sense of ownership, a piece of secret geography they feel entitled to. The barrier island was Silas Vance's backyard, and he had navigated its shoals for 60 years. And then, a notice from a federal agency in Washington had informed him that his backyard was no longer his to step on. He had kept taking. Of course he had kept taking. That was the part the case could not get around on either side of it. What Silas Vance was doing was a catastrophic theft. Every egg on that barrier island was protected federal property, crucial to the survival of a dying species. The beach was closed to save it. The clutches he was pulling were the entire reproductive future of the regional population. Take those, and you do not just take this year's hatchlings. You sever a biological chain that takes 30 years to rebuild. By the letter of the law and the reality of the biology, Silas Vance was extinguishing a species for a quick payout from an exotic meat broker. The closure had been a desperate attempt to save them, one marked nest at a time. And the RFID chips buried in his coolers would prove every one of those eggs had come from the sanctuary the law had told him to leave alone. And yet, Silas Vance was not the man who had ruined the barrier island. He was the last man still poaching a beach that decades of uncontrolled coastal development, commercial shrimping bycatch, and a world that paved over nesting grounds had already all but emptied before he made his last few trips in that skiff. He worked the old way, taking what he could carry, feeling entirely justified by the resentment of a local who watched wealthy developers destroy miles of habitat legally while he was criminalized for taking a few dozen eggs. He believed, with the bitter certainty of a man left behind by the modern world, that the island was as much his as the government's, that he knew its tides better than the agency that policed it, and that a system that let the coast be destroyed by hotels had no moral standing to call him a thief. He was entirely wrong in the eyes of the law. He was not entirely wrong about the hypocrisy of the coast. They did not have to chase him through the marsh. A man who beaches his skiff 50 yards closer every week on a shoreline watched by a camera he thought he had outsmarted is not hard to set a trap for. They took him at the nesting cluster on the night the pattern dictated he would be there. An old fisherman with a canvas sack full of marked eggs and no intention of running into the dark water. He did not deny it. The charge was the one the federal statute demanded, violating the Endangered Species Act, trafficking in protected wildlife, a felony that carries severe federal prison time and massive fines. It did not go to the absolute maximum, but it was harsh. Silas Vance was 68, and the volume of eggs he had taken over the season was devastating. He drew a federal prison sentence he might not outlive, the seizure of his boat, and devastating fines. The unbroken eggs were rushed to a specialized incubation facility by the biologists in the faint, desperate hope that a fraction of them would still hatch. That is the knot, and it is a heavy one. For a century, locals took from these islands, and the ocean always seemed to provide more. Then the world changed. The coast became a playground. The nesting grounds vanished under concrete. The demand for illicit wildlife parts exploded. and the turtles began to disappear. The Wildlife Service watched the numbers plummet and did the only thing it had the power to do, which was to lock down the last remaining sand. And locking it down turned the bitter locals who refused to adapt into major federal criminals overnight. Silas Vance robbed the world of a precious, vanishing resource. The federal court was absolutely right to lock him away. But the massive corporations that paved over 90% of the original nesting habitat were not in that courtroom, could not be charged, and are still building luxury condos on beaches where turtles used to lay their eggs. The man with the canvas sack was the one the law could easily reach and destroy. The systemic destruction that made his crime so fatal to the species was not on trial. The sanctuary was closed to save the turtles. But the population was already, by the biologists' own grim models, teetering on the edge of local extinction. Too few returning females, the genetic diversity too thin, the recovery measured in centuries, if it happened at all. So the closure may not have been saving the loggerheads so much as deciding who would be standing on the beach when they finally vanished. And the answer it produced was that the developers who ruined the coast would be counting their money, and the bitter old fisherman who took the last few eggs would be the one in a federal cell. That is not perfect justice, and it is not total injustice. It is just what is left when the wild runs out. The camera stayed on the channel marker. The barrier island was monitored, guarded, and the remaining nest protected. And the biologists will tell you carefully that the population might stabilize in 50 years, or it might be a ghost town. It had been caught too late in the grand scheme of the ecosystem, with most of the habitat already lost. But Vance had been caught because a camera bolted to rusted metal to watch a patch of sand had instead watched a skiff crawl down a beach 50 yards at a time, and kept every frame of it until a warden finally put the pieces together. When they asked Silas Vance why he did it, knowing the turtles were nearly gone, he stared out the window of the interrogation room. He said his father had pulled nets off that island before the government even knew it was there. He said he had taken less in his whole miserable life than a single dredging barge destroys in an afternoon. He was asked whether he understood that the eggs he took would never hatch, and that the beach would soon be empty forever. He was quiet for a long while. Then he said that he knew the beach better than the agents who closed it because he had watched it die his whole life, and if the whole coast was going to be dead and paved over anyway, he didn't see why he should be the only one who never got to take anything from it again. The camera on the marker above the sanctuary had been put there to watch the last of a species and to catch whoever came to finish them off. For 85 days, it watched a dark beach and a skiff that was never where it had been the week before. It watched an old man's boat come down the shoreline like an incoming tide, 50 yards at a time toward the last good nests in the sector. And it kept every frame of the beach emptying and the skiff advancing until the night the two of them finally met at the center, where the camera had been waiting the whole time. Every case on this channel starts with something that doesn't belong in the frame. A boat at the edge of the marsh, a crater where a nest used to be, a skiff that is 50 yards closer than it was with no one ever in the picture to drag it. Pay attention to what the camera keeps,